This is Data Malarkey, the podcast about using data smarter. Every organization is driven by data, but how can you turn it into powerful storytelling? By asking the right questions, discovering the insights, and building your data story. This is the podcast that talks to leaders and thinkers around the world about how they use data smarter, so you can too. Welcome to Data Malarkey.
Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Sam Knowles, and I'm delighted to say that joining us today is Professor Rusi Jaspal. Rusi is the Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Research and Knowledge Exchange and a Professor of Psychology at the University of Brighton. He's in charge of both the REF and the KEF, that is, the university's preparations for the 7-yearly Research Excellence Framework, as well as its Knowledge Exchange Framework. This means, I think I'm right in saying, that data and evidence, insight and impact are central to everything that he does. His own research is focused on psychological and physical health outcomes, especially in minority groups, including HIV prevention and care, health and mental health and well-being. From psychological well-being among gay men to management of identities in conflict, from prejudice and discrimination to the psychological impact of the COVID pandemic. I trust that's a good summary of who you are and what you do, Rusi. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today on Data Malarkey. Anything that you'd like to add, anything that I've got wrong?
Well, first of all, Sam, thank you very much for the invitation, and your introduction was very accurate. Thank you. I have nothing to add.
Very good. Well, now listen, before we get kind of down and dirty and think about data and the role that data plays clearly in your work, both as Pro-Vice-Chancellor and as Professor of Psychology, can I ask you a question? It's the favourite question of Derren Brown, the mesmerist. It doesn't necessarily ask you to tell us about your job. Derren's favourite question is, how do you spend your time?
Well, I spend my time dealing with data, actually, looking at the evidence and making decisions based upon the evidence. And I'm very mindful that the decisions that I make at work affect a lot of people around me. So it makes the use of data, the effective use of data, all that more important. As you mentioned, I'm also a professor of psychology, and although I don't do an awful lot of research during office hours, I do a lot over during the evenings and over the weekend. And I'm also mindful that part of my role also has implications for lots of people, different groups, populations, because I'm focused upon public health. And that makes me very aware of the challenges associated with effective data analysis. But also, I feel a great responsibility to ensure that the data are collected effectively and that they're analysed effectively, and I think above all, presented effectively.
Really interesting. I heard you speak at an event recently, and you were talking about the presentation of research done at the University of Brighton. Am I right in thinking in a pub in the local community in which your university sits? Could you tell us a bit more about that? Because it doesn't sound like the most immediate way in which one would disseminate academic research.
Yeah, sure. So, Sam, we've introduced the Brains at the Bevy initiative, which is held at a community pub in Bevendine. And the purpose of that initiative is to communicate the findings of research that's conducted at the University of Brighton. We decided to introduce that because, on the one hand, our research is applied. It's all about making a difference to people's lives. That's what motivates the researchers at the university. But it seemed rather problematic that only academics should be able to benefit from those findings and should be exposed to those findings. Because actually we know that when you publish in academic journals, or if you publish academic monographs and books, those outputs are intended for a very specific academic audience. We really wanted the local community to get involved in research for the following reasons. First of all, to see the value of research as a phenomenon. All of the great innovations that we take for granted these days have emerged in one way or another on the basis of research findings. So it seemed really important that we make people aware of the great benefits of research, and why that's a very good use also of funding in a funding constrained environment that we operate within. The second reason we wanted to introduce this was because we really wanted the local community to feel empowered to help shape our research, to tell us what we need to be researching, to engage in a two-way dialogue so that we're not just developing research questions that we think are important, but rather the local community also are playing a role in that, an important role in that process. And the third reason is also to inspire people around the value of research and higher education more generally, because research is fascinating. And I know you're probably thinking, Sam, of course, Rusi Jaspal would say that as Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Research and Knowledge Exchange, and you're quite right. I have a stake. But actually, way before I became the Pro-Vice-Chancellor, I was so passionate about research, its value, and asking questions and being able to find the answers, often in collaboration with people who are much more intelligent than I am, for sure, and who are much more skilled with research methods than I am.
I think it sounds like a fantastic initiative, and I mean, presumably because it's based in the local community, the majority of the people that are in the bevy to listen to that are people who are not involved in the university at all, apart from the fact they just happen to live nearby.
Absolutely, that's right. And actually, I had the great privilege of speaking to some of the attendees after one of the events, and several reported never having attended an event like that before, and actually feeling that they wouldn't understand what was going on and they'd feel quite out of place at a research event. And I think the key is really to try and present your research effectively. And it's a point I made right at the beginning of our conversation. You've got to present your work in a way that's going to be intelligible to particular groups, and also that's going to resonate with them. And actually at the Brains at the Bevy series, that's precisely what the main task of the presenter is. It's to present the research in a non-academic way, rather in a way that's geared towards public communication, public engagement.
Brilliant. Sounds fantastic. Thinking about your kind of your day job and your night shift when you're getting down to the work, could you be a little bit more specific about the role that data plays in your day-to-day life?
Yes, absolutely. So you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation the university's focus upon REF and KEF, so the Research Excellence Framework and the Knowledge Exchange Framework. They are extremely important exercises for universities because essentially they assess how well we are doing in terms of our research performance, and as well as our engagement with non-higher education institutions, and that's knowledge exchange. So it's really important. And that the outcomes of those of the REF determines the amount of investment that we get back into our research. So we call that quality related funding, and we use that funding to invest back into our research to get our academics engaged in research, so on and so forth. So there's a financial dimension to this as well. And of course, the way in which those decisions are made around the REF is all based upon data. It's all based because, of course, what happens is we submit outputs, and those outputs, so we submit journal articles, books, and so on, and those outputs are evaluated. They are given a rating, and there is a very specific criteria that are followed in order to arrive at those decisions. So we can see that's all about data. And then, of course, averages are calculated and so on. But the really interesting thing is, before the actual exercise happens, years before it actually happens, it is the job of the Pro-Vice-Chancellor to mobilize a team at the university to try and predict what those scores may be, to assess each other's outputs, and to try and anticipate how they may be evaluated. And of course, there is much scope for error to occur, because we may misattribute scores. We may believe that a particular output is better than it actually is, or we may underestimate the value of that output. So it just shows actually that it's not a very clean-cut process, because wherever humans are involved, there is scope for error. And humans are very central to data, aren't we?
We are indeed. And I think, yes, joining together this sort of fire and ice world of kind of hard data and human motivation, I think takes a real skill. In your research work, can you describe what sort of data is most important to you?
Now, that's a really difficult question, Sam. And I think the reason, I'll tell you why it's difficult, then I'll try and answer your question. I think it's difficult because I've always really passionately believed that different types of data are important to address any question. Now, you listed some of the topics that I've looked at in my research, and they're all really challenging topics with many dimensions to them. I mean, HIV, for instance, has a physical component to it when people are infected and so on, and their physical health outcomes. But there's also a very big psychological dimension to that. And of course, the same can be said for COVID-19.
Uh-huh.
So that suggests to me that we need to use different types of data, draw upon different types of data, to collect different types of data, to really get to the bottom of some of the big questions that we've got in relation to these topics. And that's seen me collect qualitative data, which I must say is rather, historically has been quite unusual for psychologists, because we like to see ourselves as scientists and we like to deal with numbers. But there's a lot that can be learned from qualitative data, like the depth of one's experience. We can look in detail at a particular phenomenon that we perhaps don't already have much data around. But I've also collected data that are highly quantitative, where we're trying to quantify often very complex psychological phenomena like self-esteem. How to find a numerical value to self-esteem? Well, it's challenging. But my argument is that only really makes sense if you've also got a qualitative dimension to it. So that's why I like to use different types of data. Now, I could go into a bit more detail, which I'm sure we will during our conversation, about the different types of qualitative data that we have and the different types of quantitative data. But your original question was, which is most important. And I guess if I were, I'd say that the quantitative data have enabled me to make more convincing assertions about larger groups of people, because often what we're trying to do when we collect quantitative data is to say something about general trends across a large group of people. And that brings us one step closer to generalizing our findings beyond the sample. And I think that's important. But there are many caveats that I'm sure we'll talk about in relation to generalizing data or findings from data.
I think that's very, very interesting, that blending, that kind of qualitative to validate quantitative and vice versa. Right? Now, I hear that particularly in some areas, not all areas of market research. Could you maybe talk a little bit? You talked about, some challenges and boy, putting a number on self-esteem, quite right. I mean, even a clustered. But can you talk about a little bit some of the challenges that you face in making sure that the data you and your teams collect is useful for and usable for you? I mean, ensuring it's clean, ensuring it's intact, and ensuring it can actually be used to test the hypotheses that you want to test.
Yes, Sam, I must say these questions keep me up at night, and I'll tell you why. As a psychologist and as a fellow of the British Psychological Society, I'm aware of the power that psychologists and many other social scientists possess in terms of effecting change in society. Often policymakers will rely upon the findings that we generate in our research. Therefore, it makes the responsibility an enormous one. The responsibility to get it right. It's a significant one. That's why I said that it keeps me up at night, because actually there is much scope, as we already discussed, for error when we're developing our research questions, when we're designing a study, and when we collect our data and when we analyze those data. But to address your question more directly, I try to triangulate my findings. So I will, of course, use measures to try and measure really complex constructs like self-esteem and self-efficacy and things like that have already been validated in other research where possible. But I will try and also triangulate the findings using other methods. And that was the point that I was making a moment ago. So if you can also collect data using a different sample, preferably in a different cultural context, that's very good. But also if you can collect some qualitative data, that can help you also to ensure that you're actually measuring what you think you're measuring. Because I'm also really mindful of something, Sam, and that is that your results, what you get out of your statistical analysis package, is as good as what you put into the research. So it depends on the instruments that you've used to collect your data. And you need to be very transparent about those instruments when you report your research findings. You need to tell your reader how it is that you've measured self-esteem. Is it just using a single item, a single question, or is it actually tapping into different dimensions of self-esteem with a multitude of questions? That's really important. You need to also be able to report things like the reliability scores, how correlated your items are with one another. So all of these things are really important. But thankfully, I think a responsible researcher, and my colleagues most certainly are, will have a checklist that they'll go through to ensure that they are doing everything that's humanly possible, that we're using every technique that we're aware of as researchers to ensure that we are collecting robust data, and then that we're analysing those data as we should be and effectively.
You talk about, and I don't like to hear anything keeping anybody awake at night, but it's good to hear that those questions do. And you've mentioned obviously being a psychologist, fellow BPS, and policymakers relying on findings. Does the replicability crisis in psychology, does that keep you awake at night? The fact that, in case our readers aren't familiar, the fact that so many psychological experiments might have been conducted maybe using the acronym WEIRD, the white, educated, industrialized samples. Does that worry you? I mean, it sounds like don't want to answer the question for you. It sounds like that you're looking, when you're saying go to another cultural context or use everything humanly possible, it sounds like you're trying to mitigate those factors.
Yes, absolutely. The first thing is it does keep me up at night, because I'm aware that we, on the one hand, have aspirations, and sometimes quite difficult to achieve aspirations, to be able to say something meaningful about human beings. I'm talking about what we try and do as psychologists. I want to be able to say something about human beings in general. But that has to be balanced against the constraints that we face when we conduct research. We often conduct research with limited or even no funding, and that limits the scope for collecting large data from large samples that are cross-cultural samples across different geographical and cultural contexts. So in a nutshell, we often rely upon our own students, and we will often collect data from willing first year, second year, third year students who, in exchange for course credits. Now, of course, that presents a number of challenges, because if you think about the demographic or the main demographics of university students, well, many universities are not very diverse. They tend to represent particular sections of society in terms of socioeconomic background, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of so many other characteristics. So we already have a sample that's not really very representative. So you're quite right that I try my very best to conduct research in a wide range of contexts and to triangulate the findings by looking at differences between groups. And I'll give you an example of that in a moment. But we have to also acknowledge that that's not always going to be possible. And where it's not possible, I reiterate, it's so important for us to be transparent about why that wasn't possible, what the limitations of our research are, and also to present very clearly future directions for research, because students will be looking at, and future researchers will be looking at research with a view to being inspired. And we can inspire them by being very clear about what the limitations of our research are, so that they can actually try and address them. And actually, Sam, some of the most exciting research I've done has been in collaboration with my PhD students, who happen to be from countries where a particular phenomenon is under-researched. Let me give you an example of that. I've done a lot of work around mental health among LGBT populations. I have students from Lebanon and Iran, where there's a great deal of stigma around LGBT populations, and therefore doing research into those topics is very difficult indeed. Yet they are starting to do that research, and therefore completing some of that very complex jigsaw puzzle, really, but by adding in pieces that reflect their own cultures.
Really, really interesting, really exciting. Thank you. That's such an interesting that it's your PhD students that are taking you there. That's fantastic. Can I shift gear a bit? I want to talk about insight. I'm quite not a purist, but I think the word insight is often particularly in business, but not uniquely in business, also in academia too. The word insight can be thrown around a bit like confetti. We've got millions of insights into this. People may tell us, well, you'll be lucky, I think, if you've got one or two. I have this definition that it's a profound and useful understanding. It's profound because it answers the question, kind of, so what do the data mean? And it allows us to move on to ask and hopefully address the more question, now what should we do as a result? Do you have not a stock or a standard approach, but what's your approach to moving from data to insight? And by all means, by the way, challenge my definition if you think it's substandard. Sure.
Well, this is a really fascinating question, because sometimes researchers will essentially describe their findings, and they'll describe what's going on in the data or what they think is going on in the data. And that can be misleading, and it can mean that we miss opportunities to provide insights. The way in which I think we should tackle that is by using theory. Theory is really important, and actually I think it's vitally important, because sometimes if we rely exclusively on data, we may observe some things in our data that don't really make logical sense. There is a correlation. It may be a very strong correlation, but what on earth does that mean? And more importantly, what is that? How can it be explained? Why is that occurring? Well, often that part of the research process is addressed by drawing upon theory. We're able to see how the data fit in with theories that we've either taken for granted for many years, or that perhaps we didn't think were applicable in our particular context, or that weren't applicable in the empirical context that we're researching. So, if you're looking at, say, the world of business, it could well be that research that's been conducted in anthropology is eminently beneficial in ascertaining business-related problems. Well, that's what the theory can help you to do. So I think that is what gets us closer to really providing insight, is by using theory in the right way. But if I can just make one more point on that, Sam. As a theory person myself, and I do love a bit of theory, we sometimes become quite committed to particular theories because they almost become part of our identity. It's a theory that you've always used. Maybe you've built your career on that theory, and you're looking for every opportunity to demonstrate that theory is the right one, and that it works, and it's robust, and it's effective. We should always put our egos aside, and we should always focus upon the actual problem at hand. And there will be times where the theory actually doesn't work. It's been proven to be inaccurate. It needs to be elaborated. Perhaps other people will elaborate it. But that's really important. So we should always engage with theory. I think that's what gives us insights.
Yeah, I think. I was before becoming a psychologist for a few years. I was a classicist originally, and I'm a big fan in the forgotten art, the lost art of asking smart questions, to encourage people to embrace their inner Socrates and admit that all that they know is that they know nothing. Not that, of course, we know a huge amount, but if we bring our biases, our assumptions, our prejudices, our prior knowledge to the research question, quite often that can lead to confirmation bias and us getting led astray. So I think that's very encouraging to hear. You've talked both about in the research excellence framework, knowledge exchange framework, your amazing sounding. If I'm allowed to, I want to go along to one of the research sessions at the Bevy to hear researchers talking in a pub. The importance of effective communication. What do you think is the best way to combine narrative and numbers in storytelling, in sharing research?
First of all, you're most welcome to come along to the Brains at the Bevy sessions. I really see you there, Sam, and indeed our listeners today. It would be really wonderful to see new people attending. Now, your question about linking data to narrative is an important one, because I would like to acknowledge something that we academics do generally, and I think perhaps psychologists do disproportionately. And that is, we overcomplicate things. We use really long words to express what's a fundamentally simple idea. And I think that sometimes we do that to to write in a particular style that's become very normative and to communicate in a way that's become very normative. So we're essentially following norms, just like we do in culture. We follow norms all the time. I mean, norms guide how we greet one another and so on. And, if you depart from a norm, people think it's a bit weird. Well, that's exactly what happens in the reporting of research findings. And I'll give you one example of that. I remember when I was writing my master's dissertation, I was researching a really personal question, actually. It was around ethnicity. And of course, as an ethnic minority person, it's a question that's very close to my heart. It's something I experience. So I used the I pronoun, the first person pronoun. I was very quickly told by my colleagues that I mustn't use the I pronoun. You should always use the third person. That's just a very basic example of a norm. And you sort of, it stays with you and you carry on doing that. And I think that is what means that we immediately close off discussions that could have taken place if we wrote in a particular style. So I think the style is a really important factor. But I think also, as I mentioned a moment ago, the use of theory when telling a narrative is important, because that's what enables that's what really enables data to resonate, the findings to resonate. I actually find it very easy to talk about psychology to a non-expert. And I'll tell you why, Sam. Because when I talk about things like relationship breakdown, prejudice, perceived threat from other people, coping, these are topics that every one of us experiences at some point during. Now, we may not admit it, but we most certainly do experience this. So these are things that should really resonate. It's now down to me to communicate that in a way and to link it to theory, because people will be because I think we're all theorists as well. I think we're all, now the term that's often used is naive theorists. I don't think we're very naive. I don't think people are naive. I think we're actually pretty good theorists. We all form patterns in our minds when we try and make sense of our own experiences and those of other people. So that's why I'm saying that people are not averse to theory. It just needs to be communicated in the right way and alongside the data.
I think you're so right to say that academics can be among the worst in using those normative styles. The Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker wrote a lovely book called The Sense of Style: The Thinking Person's Guide to Writing in the 21st Century. And he's got it's not his thought, but he's got a lovely chapter on the curse of knowledge. The fact that it's so difficult to imagine that those we're talking to don't know what we know. But it sounds like you and your colleagues are making every effort to park that curse of knowledge at the side. Of course, I've got a kind of. I'm interested in questions and asking questions. I've got a Columbo question. Is there anything about the way you work with data that I haven't asked you that you think I should have asked you?
Sure. Well, actually, I think you did ask me this, Sam. But I've been very excited by your questions so far. That I've had to really collect my thoughts and provide coherent responses on a fewer number of topics, rather than telling you all of the things that I'm passionate about. Now, one of the things you did ask me a moment ago was actually the type of data that I tend to work with. And I said I wanted to kind of go into a bit more detail on that. Now, with quantitative data, you've also got different research designs. And as psychologists, as you know, we're often trying to ascertain the cause of something. We're looking at causality. So what's caused a change in an outcome variable? So we might want to look at, we talked about self-esteem. What's causing a person to experience low self-esteem would be a question that we might ask. Now, the only way really we can ascertain that, the only real, genuine, effective way to ascertain that is by conducting an experiment. Now, we think that we know what the cause might be, and we manipulate that variable, and we assign people randomly to different conditions, and we look at whether being in a particular condition leads people to show a change in their self-esteem. Experiments can be challenging. They don't always go very well. There can be lots of extraneous variables. All sorts of things like that can occur. And a quicker way of collecting data, and often a more straightforward way of collecting data, is through surveys. And we call those data cross-sectional data. One of the really troubling things that I've observed is how some people may either at best allude to and at worst claim to be able to say something meaningful and generalizable about causality on the basis of cross-sectional survey data. You cannot do it. And I think it's problematic because of something I said earlier on in our conversation, and that is because we as researchers enjoy a great deal of power in shaping the way in which those findings will be used by influential people like policymakers. And if you claim causality on the basis of data that do not actually allow you to infer causality, that can have really big implications. And it's easy to see how in the area of public health, for instance, it could have really, really significant implications. So I think it's very important that we recognize, again, the limitations of our data. And by the way, what I'm saying is not to suggest that cross-sectional data are useless. They are very useful, but we've just got to be clear. So I think it comes back to your fundamental interest, actually, Sam, and that's narrative. It's how you're presenting your findings. It's the story you're telling, and you've got to be so honest in that story. And you've got to just focus upon what your data can plausibly and legitimately tell you based upon the design.
Great point. What's the worst example of a misuse of data that you've observed? And that can either be in your career or something that's happened in the public domain. Have you got an example of a terrible use of data?
Yes. Now, it may not sound that terrible to the outside observer, but I certainly deemed it to be terrible. And that was observing claims being made about very sensitive topics on the basis of not so reliable instruments, so not so reliable scales to measure those things. So early on in my career, I was involved in research looking at Islamophobia and other forms of prejudice such as homophobia and racism and so on. And I became aware of some people claiming that these forms of prejudice don't really exist to the same extent as before, that negative attitudes have waned. So people are a lot less homophobic these days. They're a lot less Islamophobic. They're a lot less racist these days. And actually, I think those claims were being made because of the types of scales that were being used to measure those forms of prejudice. Now, remember, we live in a society where very overt forms of prejudice are highly stigmatized. So it's very unlikely that someone would use the same sorts of epithets or the same sorts of negative statements about particular groups that they would have used, say, 40 or 50 years ago, where it was perhaps less stigmatized. My argument is that that there are still high levels of prejudice in society, but the ways in which they're being manifested and shown have changed. They've become subtler. And let me give you an example of that, Sam, in relation to, say, homophobia. We talk a lot about microaggressions, and that is more subtle forms of homophobia. People may not say gay or lesbian people are X, Y, and Z. They might actually say things that are subtler, like, oh, you don't look very gay, with the undertone being that actually looking heterosexual is the way that one should look. That's the norm. And saying things like, that's so gay, in reference to something that's negative. So there are more subtle ways in which that's being expressed. Therefore, our scales have to consistently be renovated, rejuvenated to reflect the social context in which we're collecting those data. So coming back to your original question about, a really appalling uses of data, I think using data with inaccurate, faulty instruments and analyzing those data and making claims such as these are problems that we no longer need to address in society is deeply troubling to me. As someone who's really, really committed to a just society that sees my duty as an applied psychologist to be to solve the problems that we observe, because you sort of brush those problems under the carpet and we cease to focus upon them, and people end up suffering a great deal because there is no longer any attention paid to them. And another thing that's really problematic is when people call out experiences of prejudice and so on, they often don't meet with very sympathetic responses because people think that the problem doesn't exist. a very fulsome response to your question, but hopefully you see why I find it troubling.
A terrific response. Do you have any questions for me?
Yes, I do. I do have a question for you, and that is, how did you actually get into marrying data and narrative? What really inspired you around that? Because narrative is not a noun that I associate with quantitative psychologists, but it's really important.
That's a good question. So I started life as a classicist, as I mentioned, because I was badly taught mathematics at a state grammar school in Buckinghamshire, and the things that I could do were Latin and Greek. So I did Latin, Greek, ancient history, and a degree in classics. And I went out and I fell in love with story and story structure and Aristotle and the 3-act story structure and the beginning, middle, and the end, and so on. I fell in love with that, and I then went to work in a bunch of communications agencies and in-house roles. And around the turn of the millennium, I had what was described as pre-millennial tension by one of my funny friends. And I went to go and see a psychologist, and the psychologist said, "Oh, you're very interested in psychology, aren't you? Having done the first battery of psychometric tests in my life." And I said, "Yes, I am." And I'd been reading a lot of Pinker and E.O. Wilson and Dawkins. I mean, I was really reading in a particular area, but I was interested in that. She said, "I think you should do something in psychology, maybe occupational psychology or forensic. You have an interest in natural justice." And I looked around and I thought, well, I should go back to university. I can be quite a literal person. And so I looked around and I thought, I don't need even to do a whole undergraduate degree. I can do a master's degree. And I just moved to Sussex and I stumbled across a master's in experimental psychology at Sussex, applied, had to teach myself the first year's exam or first year's course, took the exam, passed, got in. Imagine my surprise, Rusi, when I had given up living in London, moving out, never to be able to afford to return. When I went into the first 2 hours of my new life, and my first 2 hours were a statistics lecture. I thought I had really made a massive mistake. Fortunately, I had some very, very good statistic teachers who taught me that I might be able to read Latin and Greek and Sanskrit. I might be able to speak French and Italian and mostly English. Suddenly there was this new language. I had this new language of statistics to be able to do or attempt to do all of the things that you talk about. I liked it so much. I stayed on and did a doctorate. Your comments about the university opportunity sample of students, I was getting them drunk or not and showing them happy, sad, and boring pictures, but that's a totally other story. I'll tell you that at the bevy sometime. Yes. When I thought about becoming a full-time academic, but I just become a father, and I was sort of feeling I was heading towards 40, and that might be hard as a postdoc. I might be easier not to anyway. So I went back out into communications consultancy, and just at that time, data had become quite important. Facebook had been born, Twitter was there, and people who work in communications, I'm generalizing, as a reformed former communications person, people who work in communications often don't like data. They're often from the art side rather than from the social or the hard sciences side. And so I was just given all the data. They said, no, you teach statistics to postgrads. You can deal with the data. And I suddenly realized that actually, if you put these two things together in a human and judicious and empathetic way, and if you respected the data tolerance of your audience, in line with that Pinker quote from earlier, you don't try and drown people in information, but you use data as the underpinning of the narrative, then you can appeal to the emotional brain that makes the decisions and the rational brain that justifies them. And so I put 2 and 2 together and got 17. I couldn't recommend anybody lowly enough the path that I took, but actually there are very few people who call themselves data storytellers about. I'm not saying I'm a rare and precious breed, but there are loads and loads of people who look at data visualization, and data visualization is fabulous. I've got nothing against it at all. I'm not a data visualizer. I'm a verbal person. I'm a narrative person rather than a visual person. And my view is that any amount of brilliant use of Excel or Tableau or Power BI or any of the tools that one can use to visualize data are irrelevant unless you know what the story is. So that's why I do what I do. So that was a very long answer to your question, but I got there by accident. But there's the old joke. You ask somebody in the middle of the countryside, how would you get how would you get to Birmingham? I wouldn't start from here, would be the answer. But I'm here now, and I love it because there's nobody in the world that ever says, be they academia, third sector, sports analytics, there's nobody who says we haven't got enough data. The challenge they face is how they turn that into something that can persuade others to take action, exactly as you say, for ref or careful or down the path. Brilliant. Listen, Rusi, I've loved our conversations, as I knew I would. I got the sense that you haven't found it too onerous. Well, maybe some of the questions you weren't expecting, but I get the sense of you've enjoyed it too. Can you tell our listeners, our viewers, where they can find out about you most easily, either online or in social media? And I can include that in the show notes to this episode.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, Sam, thank you so much for the invitation. It's been a really enjoyable 40 minutes talking about data, a topic that we're both very passionate about. I couldn't think of a more appropriate conversation partner about this topic than you. So that's been a real pleasure. In terms of contacting me, I think I'm very active on Twitter, and my Twitter handle is at Prof. R. Jaspal. So that's my first initial and my surname. So yes, I really hope to be able to engage with people who are equally as passionate as we are about data on this very topic. And if I could just say as we're ending, that I found your story of how you got into this really quite inspiring, because there's one word that jumps to mind, and that's interdisciplinarity. You are very interdisciplinary, and I think that is absolutely key to solving the world's problems. It really is. We've got to be able to combine different skills that we have as individuals, but also bring people with different disciplinary backgrounds together. And so I see absolutely no incompatibility between being a classicist and a data analyst, scientist, psychologist.
Very good indeed. Listen, thank you so much for your time, Rusi. Thank you for sharing your approach to using data smarter. I think it's fair to say if there were only more people like you in the world, there'd be much less malarkey about data and much more wisdom. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to Data Malarkey, the podcast about using data smarter. To find out what kind of data storyteller you are, why not take our data storytelling scorecard? It takes just 2 minutes to complete and will give you a personalized report right away. Visit data-storytelling.scoreapp.com or follow the link in the show notes.